thank you for joining us today for our first of several mini Lunch and Learn workshops. My name is Alex Irvine. I'm president of Irvine & Associates, a land use consulting firm here in Los Angeles. I'm also co-founder of Brickwork, which is an internet-based platform that provides feasibility analysis for properties in the city of LA and throughout Southern California. As part of our Lunch and Learn series, we invite qualified professionals to provide brief presentations and lead discussions for the topic of the day. And today's topic for our Lunch and Learn is the 2018-2019 California State Housing and Planning legislation. And who better to lead this discussion than the person in charge of monitoring these bills and incorporating into the City of Los Angeles zoning code, Matthew Glesney. Matthew is a city planner for the Los Angeles Department of City Planning, where he leads the department's housing and policy unit and is responsible for developing various citywide housing-related initiatives. Matt has recently been involved in the development of the city's accessory dwelling unit policy, the transit-oriented communities program, the home sharing ordinance, the affordable housing linkage fee, density bonus, as well as coordinating the implementation of state legislation, amongst probably about a dozen other things. Matt has a master's degree in urban and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and another master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So with that, Matt, why don't you kick us off and take it away.
Well, thank you, Alex. Really pleasure to be here for your inaugural event. I hope I don't ruin it for everybody going forward. And, keep this interesting. We're going to get a little wonky. I hope we're ready. We're going to dig into some state laws here that make some adjustments. Some of them quite significant, some of them a little more minor. But wanted to give everyone a sense of what happened last year with the 1819 legislative package. There was this big housing package kind of signed, by the governor, and it was sort of all these bills sort of put together as a sort of a package. And I think they're trying to do the same thing this year, kind of look at a balanced approach that looks at all sides of the housing angle and kind of does it in a comprehensive way. This, I think, was probably one of the most significant years for housing, but I think this year now is looking much bigger. I just heard that 1 out of every 5 bills in Sacramento is a housing bill. So we could be in for much more next year. But this is about what happened last year and what it went into effect in July 1st, 2019. We'll touch on about 13 pieces of legislation that became effective. Obviously continuing this trend of significant housing legislation that aims to sort of increase the expectations and put more expectations on local governments in large part, and their expectations to make progress towards meeting their housing goals and building enough housing and responding to the state's housing crisis. These sort of fall under 4 buckets: density bonus law, so a number of updates to state density bonus law, as well as a number of streamlining bills and just sort of under the rubric of removing barriers for housing production. Some bills on the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and fair housing. Talk probably a little bit more than maybe you want about that just because I'm really fired up. I just came from SCAG. They're working on all the RHNA stuff right now, and it's really interesting how they're responding to some of these things in the bill. And as well as just some sort of miscellaneous topics on homelessness, redevelopment, et cetera. And then we'll touch very briefly, I think, on some of the 2019 bills, including SB 50. So just one slide of sort of background. What is the state doing this for? What's the context here? I think this chart sort of says it all. This is housing production statewide, California, since about the mid-50s up until recently, along with the red line kind of roughly approximating what the state estimated the number of units that are needed each year. As you can see, we were building enough over that line through much of the early 50s, 60s, 70s to the 80s. California was a much more affordable place back then. We were averaging about 180,000 units per year for about 30, 40 years, up until about 20 years ago. When you look at the average now, it's about 80,000. So going from 180,000 average over 30 years to 80,000 on average in the last 15, 20 years. And that is far below what the state believes, again, is necessary to meet current projected population growth and sort of keep that balance between housing and population level, keep prices level. Of course, that exact number is an estimate, but that sort of just gives you an idea of how the state has been falling behind and why these legislation are being proposed. So first, we're going to go right into density bonus law. As many of you know, this is one of the most significant pieces of state legislation. There was sort of an earlier version, but the big change to density bonus came in 2005 with SB 1818. And there's been probably almost every year, I feel like there's amendments to density bonus law. I think there were 3 or 4 bills this year, mostly minor tweaks. This particular one, AB 2753 from Assemblywoman Friedman, is really on the process. And so you guys will probably be interested in this and how well cities are doing on this. But cities now must provide a determination to applicants regarding, number 1, the amount of density bonus you're eligible for. Number 2, if requested, what you're eligible for in terms of parking reductions. There are parking reductions built into state law, depending whether you're near transit, sometimes on the type of the project, and then there's just sort of basic parking reductions that everyone can request. And third, whether the applicant has given sufficient information for the city to make a determination about the incentives and waivers. So there's some findings in the state law about you have to provide up to 3 incentives, for example, if you find that those are necessary to provide for the affordable housing costs that you're providing in that density bonus project. And so it's just saying that cities need to tell the applicants that, have you given us what we need to make that determination that yes, you need these incentives to provide for the affordable housing costs. The other findings are sort of about health and safety, for waivers, waivers of development standards beyond the 3 incentives. Are those incentives needed because they physically preclude the construction? And this is something that's not in our local ordinance. I'm sure maybe some of you know, but state law changed on that point, I think 2 years ago. These waivers are very important beyond the 3 incentives. We can only now grant those waivers if those waivers are needed because they physically preclude that density bonus project you have with the density and the 3 incentives. If you cannot build that project, then you can request waivers if you cannot build it physically. It used to be more of an economic-based finding, so now it's more of a physical. So that's something you guys should be providing to the city, why you need the waiver, because I cannot build my project without the waiver. Cities also must adjust this information as it changes, and then determinations must be based on the development project as it's submitted at the time it's deemed complete. I think there had always been some question about when you get sort of vested. This has a specific kind of vesting provision now that I think kind of moves the needle on that a little bit, actually. From often we could think about vesting when you pay for plan check. This now says when you submit your density bonus application. So I think City of Los Angeles, I think we do all this. We have an affordable housing referral form, AHRF, where we kind of tell you here's the density that you're eligible for, here's the incentives, et cetera.
Just a quick question regarding the waiver. What's the threshold for not being able to build a project?
Yeah, so it's 2 separate. They used to both be kind of based on economics, but now they're separated, whereas the 3 incentives, in the city of LA we have a menu, but every city per state law has to offer 3 incentives, and those are based on, do you need those incentives to provide for the affordable housing? So that's more of an economic, I need extra height to offset the affordable housing, and normally that's a pretty straightforward thought process. That extra height helps me pencil the project. The waivers is what's changed and gotten a little more away from the economics, and now it's about, you have this project with your density and your up to 3 incentives. Can you physically build that? Or is there something else, some other development standard, not just anything else, but a development standard, an objective criteria that is preventing you from building that building with your 3 incentives and your density bonus? There's something else that I just can't build it. Okay, another density bonus bill, SB 1227 from Senator Skinner. Up from Berkeley. This is about student housing. So there's a new student housing provision in density bonus law that applies to all cities doing density bonus projects. And my understanding is this is because student housing has always been a bit different. Often it's sort of, beds based on, sort of a dorm style, co-living. The incomes of students are often hard to document. So, how do you get a low-income student in there if they don't have income status yet? So this tried to clear some of that up and facilitate projects, student housing projects using density bonus. It says that projects where at least 20% are affordable for lower income. So there's a higher lower income requirement. than normal density bonus, which would maybe only require something like 11, 15% on the low income. So this is asking for 20% to get that 35% density bonus. It applies to students enrolled full-time at an institution, higher education, and it defines low income in a brand new way. So instead of just looking at your household income and having to show tax returns at housing department like normally happens, these we would have to show a Cal Grant, which I'm not from the state of California. I'm not quite sure what it is. I believe it's it's sort of the way the universities determine low income students if you are eligible for a Cal Grant. So you would show that a certain percent, 20% at least of your population in this building are Cal Grant recipients, and then they qualify for low income. Development must provide priority for students experiencing homelessness. The density bonus, this is interesting, is not calculated based on units. The density bonus is calculated on the number of beds. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around that a little bit, like how that works exactly in practice, but I imagine you'd have to show how many beds are in your base building, and then you get a bonus on that number of beds. So you're gonna have to kind of counting beds on plans perhaps rather than counting units. And then the rent levels, the allowable rent levels are actually specifically defined, again, separate from all other density bonus. Now you have to meet this very particular 30% of 65% AMI for a single residency studio. It's about $700. So they got very specific about the rent levels they'd like to see, as well as the income levels. Another density bonus law, this one based on a case, a court case that actually the city won. But there's, as often happens, the court says something, the legislator says, no, that's not quite the way we intended it. So in this case, we're talking about the relationship between density bonus law and the Coastal Act. Two very important state priorities in state law. And it's often been unclear to a lot of people what exactly takes precedence. You know, we're allowed to reduce parking, we're allowed to increase heights through density bonus normally. But in the Coastal Act, you have very specific findings about coastal access, which very much gets into parking, and Coastal Commission very concerned with having enough parking spaces to not limit visitor access. They're very much worried about aesthetics of the coastal zone, so you have to make these findings about aesthetics. And sometimes an extra story could be found to disrupt the harmony of the aesthetics of a community, and that's exactly what happened in this case, Calnell Gardens versus the city of LA. We had basically said that we don't think this qualifies for the coastal, does not meet the coastal findings because of the parking and the height. We could not make those findings. That was appealed and that was upheld, that the city of LA was correct in basically asserting that these impacts to the Coastal Act need to be looked at, evaluated, and allows you to deny otherwise allowable incentives for height and parking. So a court upheld that decision, but now here state law saying that's not quite the way we wanted it. We wanted both laws to be in harmony. We wanted both laws to have equal measure, I suppose. So one doesn't trump the other, whereas you could argue in the other case it was clear that the coastal trumped the density bonus. Here's state law saying we want them to be harmonized. Now, what does that mean in practice? How do we harmonize? I think we're all going to continue to still learn, and this is probably going to be very case by case. I mean, I think we're telling planners to really just do a much more rigorous analysis. If you're going to make, you know, parking access findings or height aesthetic findings, make sure you've done a really good job and not just making a blanket statement. You should really be looking at the parking in that area and have some analysis to justify your decision, and really make sure that you're giving both weight to both laws and fully considering the fact that density bonus should be harmonized. So I'm sure this is going to be playing out in future cases. I'm already hearing about some cases where this is arising, and they're going to Bloom's office, who wrote this bill, and did you mean for this type of thing to happen with this law? And so, you know, big part of the law is what was the legislative intent, and I think we're all going to find out as these cases move forward. But this is the intent of the legislatures, to harmonize these laws a little bit better than had been before. Okay, this is, I think, a quick one. AB 2372 came from San Diego, Assemblywoman Gloria from San Diego. This is an optional provision of density bonus law. So this is not a requirement of cities, this, like the other three were. This is saying cities now can, in their local density bonus ordinances, create a floor area ratio, an FAR bonus, in lieu of a density bonus. And so normally we give 35% density. Some jurisdictions don't regulate density. I believe in San Diego that's the case, and so they were looking more at a floor area bonus and how does that work. And so they sort of came up, here's a formula, and they got very specific about what a floor area bonus could look like if you adopt this in your local ordinance. And it's kind of a formula based on base density times site area. And I did a whole example here just to show R3, that equals out to 2.85 FAR, and R4 it jumps up to 5.6 FAR. So it's very interesting. They got very specific about how to calculate those floor area bonuses, and results in big bonuses if you're in an area with high density, like an R4 zone. So I don't see the City of Los Angeles picking up on this. We regulate by density primarily. We have floor area bonuses built into the law already. It's a secondary component. This is really giving an FAR bonus in lieu of the density bonus. There's some other standards about what the site has to provide for, has to be located near transit. You don't get a height along with your floor area, which is fairly interesting, very specific parking incentives as part of that as well. So this is kind of a package that San Diego, we hear, might be doing this, but I'm not sure other cities are.
Density bonus typically applies to residential. Do you know if this assembly bill could also apply to commercial since it's floor area instead of density?
I don't think this did. I think this is similarly for residential projects, but there is the past session. So in 2018 they passed, or maybe 2017 they passed the commercial density bonus. So there is now, apart from this, a commercial density bonus, commercial floor area bonus option if you partner with an affordable housing developer off-site. You donate some of your land to do a bit of affordable housing on site. There's various ways you can get that. It's complicated. I don't remember if we've talked about that, Alex, but we've certainly had conversations trying to unpack that law. And that problem there doesn't get very specific. Like this one's very specific. That commercial density bonus kind of gives cities a lot of discretion to say yes or no about how much affordable housing for how much commercial floor area. It's not quite specified. And so we sort of have to come up with internal policies. We've had some discussion, but so far nobody's moved forward and been able to take advantage of that. This is a very interesting, very wonky, but in the weeds kind of way. This could be very significant in some jurisdictions. This bill AB 3194. It's really around the relationship of density and how that works when your zoning says one thing and your land use may say another thing about density. So what this does is it amends the Housing Accountability Act. This is one of the most significant long-standing state housing laws there's been. Basically what it says is cities, local jurisdictions have to approve projects consistent with objective zoning standards unless you make very difficult findings. So your denial has to be based on objective criteria. If you're making a decision on non-objective or more subjective criteria where there can be differences of opinions, you have to make some very hard findings about health and safety, et cetera. So this usually doesn't come up until you get to sort of the council floor and the council's thinking about denial or the APC's thinking about denial. Usually an attorney will pipe up and say, you're gonna have to make these findings. So they're very difficult findings if you're gonna deny this project. It's for denials as well as reductions of densities now. So denial or a significant reduction of density, you have to make these findings. So that's existing law, very powerful law, as I said. I'm curious about how well cities across the region enforce this law, because it really, requires somebody to kind of enforce it and be paying attention. And a lot of developers I don't even think know about this law. Maybe that's you guys' job. But what this does is amend that existing law about density. And what it says is, if zoning for a site is inconsistent with the general plan, then you are considered consistent with your objective standards if you comply with the general plan. So it sort of says now you can look at your general plan and your zoning and try to see if you're consistent with one of those. Now most cities don't have very detailed standards in their general plans, so there's not a lot you're going to look in a Los Angeles general plan and find. But density is one thing. That is, we do have density limits per our general plan land use categories. And this does appear to be saying now that if the density, so zoning maybe says something about density, but the general plan may say something else about density. Our understanding is the intent here is to say that density would be off whatever's greater. So if you have more density in your land use, you can apply for that under the Housing Accountability Act. I'll just say, just a quick caveat, our understanding is that would not change allowable uses. So like single family zoned has not only a density limit, but a use restriction. You could only do one family dwellings on a single family.
So let's say low, medium, or just medium general plan designation. I'm an R3 property. I want to build to R4 density.
Mm-hmm.
Do I even need the zone change under what this is saying? In other words, within that land use category,
Yeah.
I can still achieve what the general plan wants, just I have a different zoning designation.
Right.
Rather than apply for a zone change.
Yeah. I think that's the million-dollar question. I'm going to be a little coy about it and say it's a case by case, but that's what the law says. So you can certainly make your case, and we have not done one of these yet, and because it seems like when they do come out of the woodwork, there's some other issue. There's a use issue, but if it would. This bill's in effect as of January 1st, but I think generally, yeah, where that scenario where it's just maybe R3, but the plan allows R4. Maybe.
It's like
Maybe.
Does it work in reverse if the land use designation is inconsistent with the zoning? The zoning allows for residential uses or density, but the land use designation.
Yeah, I mean that's the default. We always use the zoning. Okay. So if the zoning's higher, then that takes effect. Yeah. So, but it does kind of work in reverse, like you're saying. Yeah.
I mean, this sounds like if you're consistent with everything, and then for some reason the council or somebody thinks you're too dense, and they just want to reduce your density, they can't do that just because of pushback from the community or stuff like that, right? I mean, that sounds like this might be more than
That's what the Housing Accountability Act is essentially saying. The broader law has always been about you can't just make a subjective. I think it's out of character unless you could point to a specific objective standard that it doesn't meet. It's higher than your neighbors. That's an objective, but lack of compatibility is not considered objective. So you're right. I mean, normally the way projects die in LA, you guys probably know CEQA. This does not affect CEQA. So CEQA findings are still, you're able to deny projects and reduce density through CEQA all day long. But this is saying, like, for example, say a site plan review case, and planning department wanted to say you're not compatible per site plan review. In my reading, that's not a sufficient basis to deny the project altogether. You'd have to cite an objective standard.
Has this been resolved with the Coastal Act as well, where compatibility is a requirement for your findings?
I want to say the coastal's excluded from this. I'm not sure about that. Though. But there is a number of exemptions. I didn't get into all the details of the bill, but I think there are some exclusions that I probably didn't have time to talk about here. This is a really neat adaptive reuse bill that came out of Assemblywoman Friedman's. She's from Glendale. She cited the City of Los Angeles' adaptive reuse ordinance as an example of a really great housing production tool that revitalized downtown, and as I'm sure all of you know. So this is taking it statewide, certain concepts that are already in our local law, and making them statewide. So I'm not sure how much this will affect, again, the city, because we had a lot of this, but other jurisdictions. And it's basically just saying when you're converting or adapting a designated historic resource, which is something on the local, state, or federal registers, that you shall not require parking greater than basically what's in there already if it's residential. So the number of existing spaces, if it's residential, you don't have to add any. That's what our adaptive reuse ordinance says. It goes a little further. I don't think we have this in ours. This is for a non-residential adaptive reuse to commercial office or something from another use. They don't get to waive their parking altogether, but they do get a 25% reduction in what would otherwise be available in their parking. The catch is that conversions have to be done according to historic standards. So our Office of Historic Resources will look at that. So this is a very exciting adaptive reuse bill at the state level.
Can this be processed concurrently with the historical designation, or does one have to come before the other?
It appears to me you'd have to be at least designated at the time.
It's approved.
Yeah, but
Like
exact
you
timing,
submit
could you do them
to-
concurrently?
Yeah.
I'd have to look closer. I'm not sure if there's specific language on that, but certainly by the time you approve this, it would have to be a designated
Sure.
resource. But
And then you wouldn't have to wait to submit that application.
yeah, like a two-step, can you kind of do them concurrently?
Yeah.
I'd have to look closer. That's a good question. Yeah. So now we're in the streamlining world, and a lot of you probably knew about SB 35, which was a big streamlining bill from 2 years ago, streamlined housing under certain criteria, certain amount of affordability levels, and applies different in different jurisdictions. This is a streamlining bill just focused on supportive housing, permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless individuals or households. Calling that out is a really unique and special and important use. And we actually did the same thing in the city of LA. Some of you may know. We passed the supportive housing ordinance maybe 2 years ago to really streamline supportive housing. recognizing HHH and how important it is to get these projects moving quickly. So we did that ordinance. It got sued by Ansequa. So we've been basically advising affordable housing developers not to use that streamlining bill that we passed because of the risk until the courts sort that out. Some private folks are using our supportive housing ordinance, sort of a lower tolerance for risk, higher tolerance for risk. But this is now taking it statewide, and this actually took a lot from our local ordinance. They sort of cut and pasted a lot from our bill, our local LA bill, into the state law again, making it a by right, streamlined use in all multifamily zones if it qualifies, basically 100% affordable, 25% for the target homeless population, 55 years. This notion that you should have supportive services as part of the plan, that's really what makes supportive housing what it is. It's low income, it's for homeless, but it also has services on site or off site. This actually requires they be on site. So you've got to show 3% of your floor area as dedicated for those service areas. And you also have to submit a supportive service plan. Those are the types of things that HSID normally requires, but this would be required to take advantage of this. It comes with very specific timelines. It's must approve within 60 days for smaller projects, 120 days for larger projects. It comes with a 0 parking requirement for all units, basically all the supportive housing units for the homeless individuals, I believe only, if you're located within a half mile of transit. So I'm sure we've got some folks on the line. We're all trying to figure this law out. As a lot of things, it's not as clear, and sort of some of the nuances and the difference between cities and how exactly it works. Just like SB 35, this says you get to qualify for this if you're meeting all the objective standards. It says you can combine a density bonus with that. But of course, so that's straight ahead enough, but what about all these other things? What about TOC? Can you combine it with TOC? Can you combine it with these new CPIOs, these community plan implementation overlay zones that have their own little bonus systems in some of our new community plans? Is that considered you're meeting objective criteria? Number of other questions, how exactly, what exactly does this do? For example, if you have a conditional use permit for additional density, this is a real case we have. So, that's part of our density bonus law. We have this conditional use to go above 35% density. This law, just like SB 35 says, you waive conditional use processes. They become ministerial variation of a CUP. So what does that look like? We've never done that before. What does a ministerial CUP look like? Do you still notify? Do you still have the public hearing? Do you have an appeal right? A lot of questions. We've got some answers, but not enough. I'm sure as Jeff on the line will tell you. We're still waiting for some interpretations just on some of these nuances. And so I can tell you we spent a lot of time trying to really give the best advice to protect clients, prevent projects, to make sure that we're doing it right to defend these projects as they go into sort of CEQA battle oftentimes. And so if this provides a CEQA exemption, we know some folks are going to still try to find a way to go after the project. So wanting to make sure we do it right in the most defensible way. And right now we're taking you could say a more conservative approach of, only stripping out those areas that are specifically called out to be exempted. So the CEQA, the discretionary component, but maintaining things like going to the Planning Commission. So the law doesn't say skip Planning Commission public process. In fact, it says if you have public oversight, go to your public oversight. It just has to be completed in a certain amount of time. Of course, it becomes a different kind of public process. It's focused very strictly on, does this meet the objective criteria in the zoning? Does it meet the criteria in the law? Shouldn't be talking about all kinds of other subjective things, but those are the kind of questions and kind of where we're at. But I'm sure there will be questions on this.
Has the department seen a lot of these cases actually be submitted? And I guess if you know, what's the process? What has the process been like for these applications?
Yeah. We've seen a handful of these and SB 35. I think probably 2 or 3 of these, 2 or 3 of the other ones. A lot still kind of waiting for the resolution of some of these nuanced questions. I wish we would get straight ahead ones, like just ones that just met the code or just a straight density bonus. Those are easy. But when these nuances come up is where we're making sure we take them in the right way. Some of them have gone super quickly. They've been done in the 60 days. There's been smaller. I think we just got one out in 60 days. Some of them had to go to Planning Commission, and they're taking a longer amount of time. But these have been approved. We've approved a couple of them. We just had one in San Pedro. It's approved. The catch is that we do initial review in this first 60 days to determine compliance. And if we see something that's either we don't have the information to judge compliance or it's not in compliance with zoning, we can basically send it back and say this does not comply. And our understanding of state law gives cities the option of resetting the clock at that point or like pausing the clock and letting you come back at the same period. I think in a couple cases we have reset the clock. We're continuing always talking about that, and obviously the message here is streamlining, and so trying to meet that policy intent, but also wanting to make sure we have enough time to give ourselves a thorough review and that these projects really are bulletproof.
The conditional use process, for example,
Yeah.
for increased density, if that's incorporated on a project, some of these development projects can have a substantial density bonus increase that's, 100, 300% plus, which the city does provide that as long as you meet, a certain ratio of affordable housing versus market rate. And obviously on these, you're really looking at 100% affordable type projects, right? Do you think that there is a limit to the amount of, density that could be increased on a project? It appears that the sky's the limit as long as it's reasonable and you can still qualify for the objective standards.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think we're saying that there's not an artificial limit. I mean, the law, the CUP that you're talking about has a affordability scale that as you request more density, the affordability goes up alongside it. So that is an objective criteria that we do enforce. The affordability is enforced so that's somewhat a natural limit. Again, they're limited by the affordable in the state law here. But I don't see anything else that puts an artificial cap on that. If you're doing the affordable housing levels, you get there. Now that's just density. That doesn't mean you get the below pasture building envelope. But for density, yeah, we're arguing that, number one, it's a CUP, and CUPs are specifically in this law called out as you cannot enforce the discretionary components of a CUP. And it also says you get to include your density bonus provisions as part of what's considered the objective conforming project. And so the CUP, as I mentioned, is part of our density bonus ordinance. So we think there's a strong argument that those should be streamlined, and we don't see a cap on it. But they are sort of naturally limited by the affordability. Into the world of RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So this is probably a little bit outside of your world, but this is very significant. This is the state's original way to get jurisdictions to plan for housing at a regional scale and try to say that cities have to do their fair share, that the cities cannot just say we're not interested in any more housing, we're not interested in apartments. This state law says there's going to be a process every 8 years to determine what the regional housing need is. That gets allocated to cities through a process that's happening right now. I was just over there at SCAG, and they're figuring out how to deal with these new laws, because this is changing kind of how those formulas work at least in a fundamental way. They're trying to get away from some of the issues. You may have heard about this in relation. There were some articles with, say, Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills, right next to the city of LA, huge job center, subway coming there. Their RHNA goal for 8 years was to build 3 units. So this was trying to say, and the reason that happened, and that's not to pick on one city, because this happens to a lot of cities. Basically, if you've not been growing for 30 years, you've been stagnant, you've just been not building much housing, your population's been stable, that gets built into your projection. You're going to continue to be stable, and those projections form the basis of RHNA in the past. So it's all about just continuing the projections. What these laws try to do now is to go a little further and reflect existing housing need, not just projected housing needs. So it's trying to say we have this huge backlog. We have this housing supply crisis that's accumulated. Let's try to use the RHNA process to allocate and correct for that. Because what these RHNAs do, these numbers, the 3 units or the 5 units, they're mostly, in the city of LA, ours is 82,000 units. We had to show the state, when we do our housing element, that we have enough zoning for those sites. So it forces cities to upzone these numbers. And so that's why it's hugely important. So now they're trying to say, yeah, you may not have huge projections, but you have huge housing needs existing, accumulated, and so we want those numbers to try to reflect that. The way it does that is try to look at overcrowding rates, vacancy rates, low-wage jobs, and cost burdens as sort of measurements of you've got an existing need. But it's very vague, and so that's what the MPOs like SCAG are trying to figure out right now is how do we do that? How do we put these measures? It just says look at overcrowding. Okay, we look at overcrowding, but how does that turn into a number for a region and for jurisdictions? It becomes very tricky. It's like very interesting to see how they are, I'll just leave it at that, very interesting to see how they are responding. Obviously there's huge pressure on these regional governments to keep the numbers low. You know, you got 180 jurisdictions who do not want to upzone. And so the sentiment in the room is do everything you can to sort of minimize the numbers, and SCAG staff's in a really hard place to try to reconcile what the state's trying to do with the local jurisdictions, with the regional policies around sustainability. How does that all come together is all being worked out right now when they're doing the RHNA methodologies. The law also says to emphasize fair housing goals. So this is a new goal, a new top line RHNA goal, is that the RHNA should try to further fair housing. So that means addressing legacies of segregation, exclusion, lack of integration. So there's implicit now in the RHNA should try to move the distribution a little bit in the direction of furthering fair housing opportunities where they may have not existed before. You think about wealthy, single-family only areas. I think that's what they're trying to do here is don't just put all the density in the areas that are already dense. Let's try to have a more equitable process. So it's, again, interesting how they're going to deal with that. What does that actually mean in practice? Also prohibits the underproduction of housing or stable population as a justification for your numbers. Well, I just said that's basically what it's always been based on. It's always been on, you know, what did you do in the past? That's going to continue. Well, this says you can't do that. So I just asked a very pointed question at the meeting how they're accounting for that, and I think it's TBD. But this is all part of the new law. You're not supposed to base the RHNA on what's happened in the past. It's supposed to be more forward-looking. But again, it's all like a lot of these state laws up to interpretation. On this topic of affirmatively furthering fair housing, this is this lingo that really came out of the federal government and the courts around disparate impacts and fair housing and segregation and integration, trying to say that you may have an objectively neutral zoning code, but you have to look at disparate impacts. Does that objectively non-biased single family here, multifamily here, does that worsen and make impacts on disparities even worse? And there's court decisions that said yes, and the HUD administration under Obama, this was HUD's big change that the Obama administration said, we are going to analyze every city's dollars, how they spend their dollars, how they spend their CDBG, home dollars, through this lens now. That cities are going to have to demonstrate and go through this analysis to show how they're affirmatively furthering fair housing and not just perpetuating the status quo. That was sort of weakened, if not basically killed by this current Trump administration. So that's not really happening anymore at the federal level. This is the state of California now saying we want to do it in California. Even though the Fed's not going to require it, we are going to look at through all of our housing community development programs in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. So there's going to be new analysis in pretty much every housing community development program coming out of the city. Local cities is going to have to look through this lens. Are you taking meaningful actions that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusivity? So that's a new analysis, and then it also has to be part of our housing elements and part of the RHNA, as I mentioned before. So this is a new lens, a very important lens that all jurisdictions will have to look through. SB 1333. This will not affect the city of LA, but this is very technical. But as you may know, planning law, state law, is largely not enforceable if you're a charter city. Planning law. Housing law, on the other hand, is. Housing law has the ability to go over all charter cities and general law cities. So as you may realize, housing and planning are not two distinct things. They're often very related. So how do you know, is this a housing mandate or is this a planning mandate? Has come up in some court decisions, and I think it was Huntington Beach. I think this is a Huntington Beach case where they said, yes, housing element law is all well and good, but we're a charter city and we don't really think we need to meet this requirement of like maintaining enough sites. Like they basically downzoned. They showed the state we have enough RHNA sites here in 1 year, and then a couple years later they downzoned those sites. So they no longer had the sites to meet their, and they said we don't have to because we're a charter city. Well, this law has now made that clear that that's not going to be happening anymore, that even charter law cities are going to have to comply with these requirements in terms of the housing element requirements. Zoning ordinances has to be consistent with the adopted general plan. We already had this, I think we had this, somebody been around for a while may remember AB 283, the zoning consistency back from the 70s and 80s. We had to go through every single block and figure out, does our planning meet our land use, meet our zoning, and do a consistency. So we were already doing it. There was a state law just for us. Now the whole state's gonna have to do it. So I wanna mention this Enhanced Infrastructure Finance District, EIFDs. You might be familiar with this, is sort of redevelopment 2.0. The idea of you could tax an area that is gonna have a lot of revitalization, kind of tax the increment and the increase in property values as development concentrates, and then you can recycle those dollars back into that same area, kind of like redevelopment used to do. That's it for 2018. Just quick on 2019, SB 50. I won't probably belabor this because we just heard the news that SB 50 is a dead bill for this year. It got transitioned into a 2-year bill. But this is obviously a hugely significant bill. We're all watching very closely. Planning just did an analysis on it. We did actually 2 reports because it got changed on May 1st. So we did a supplemental report. So we've got some maps and analysis of how this bill would affect. This is, I think, now a little bit out of date information because it has changed. But yeah, I don't think I'll belabor this, but certainly that's the bill everyone's watching. But there's a whole other lot of other bills that are kind of flying under the radar that are also very significant. I'll just mention SB 330, AB 1279, a host of ADU bills, et cetera. So, but I'm happy to answer any questions about SB 50.
There was mention of SB 4, I think. It was the competing bill for this.
Yep.
Do you know what the status is of that bill?
Yeah. So that was the bill that was actually merged with SB 50 at the it was like an April 23rd hearing and the May 1st amendments. So it was 2 bills. It was like kind of competing bills. I think Senator McGuire from the Marin County wasn't on board with last year's 827, so he put forward the SB 4 to sort of, here's what I think is a way to do kind of zoning, local control issues, single family. His whole thing was the fourplexes. That was what SB 4 was based on. Basically fourplexes in single family zones. So that is now incorporated into SB 50. And so the way it works is there's sort of, you have the SB 50 incentives, which are called equitable communities incentives. If you're near bus and job rich areas or near rail, you get even more. Now there's a whole separate parallel thing, which SB 4, so you kind of have 2 separate parallel tracks, which is allowing the fourplexes by right, that was again the SB 4 provision. So they kind of merged those bills. SB 4 is dead essentially, and put into SB 50. But yeah, so it applies. SB 4 is only in counties under 600,000. So instead of near rail, on rail you would get 45, 55 feet is the way SB 50 was written before. SB 4 said no, in small counties under 600,000, you don't get that minimum 55, 45 feet. You get a different scenario. You get 1 extra story. And so they merged those 2. So you've got 2 tiered systems. You get 55 feet in LA, but in Santa Barbara County, you don't get that. You only get 1 extra story on top of existing zoning. And then on top of that is the fourplex thing. The fourplex is statewide, irregardless of transit or jobs or anything. It's a statewide provision. In every zone you allow residential, you can get up to 4 units as long as it's on a vacant site or you're sort of minimally expanding the footprint of an existing building. But I'll note it's a by right process, whereas like SB 50 doesn't change process. So SB 50 gives you new zoning, but doesn't change the process. So if you still had to go through a discretionary process, you would, whereas this fourplex, SB 4 part, becomes by right. So that's another important part.
A quick question. I've heard rumors that there's an effort, because a lot of the pushback against TOC by local communities, that somehow they're going to whittle away at some of the provisions of TOC. Is that true, or?
So there's always discussions about our TransitOriented Communities program. That's about 1.5 years old, and certainly producing a lot of housing, which some people love, but not everyone loves, as you said. So there's continued dialogue. There's no imminent plans to make any changes. I'll just note that the TOC was unique because it came out of the voter initiative, Measure JJJ, which explicitly gave the department the authority to come up with the specifics in the guidelines, did not call for a city council review or a secret review. That's a kind of awkward way of saying, council could request, but I think the discretion does remain with the planning department and us we would have to bring it to our planning commission. I think we're evaluating constantly the program and what it's doing, and maybe there are some things that we're looking at were not quite the way we thought. On both sides, we went too far, we didn't go far enough, we didn't think about some things. So I think we're always thinking about sort of improvements and what a package might look like. And so I'm not to say that would never happen, but there's nothing imminent that I'm aware of, any changes, except you are likely to see a republishing of the TOC guidelines with some clarifications. So we did that in February. We just trying to make the document more usable. And what do we mean by this? So just not changing any meaning, but clarifying. So you're likely to see that be updated again fairly soon. And that'll likely be combined with an update to the map. And so that's there's been a lot of buzz about that. We've given some heads up that is coming. The map is gonna, I think, cause some alarm because the map is gonna have fewer sites overall, most likely. We've been using the same map since September 2017. And obviously, in the year and a half, we learn a lot of things. People come in and we say, well, that's on the map, but it actually doesn't meet the criteria. And we've always said that map is just for reference purposes only. Please, the way you go verified is go to the counter, get your tier verified. They actually, make sure the transit is still active. It often changed in a year and a half. And then there were things like, layover stops, like, Wilshire and Western, there's a parking lot where buses come together. We had counted that as an intersection, but actually you can't board the bus there. It's just a stop, layover stop. So little things like that we've realized that's not a real stop. It says it on the map. So basically the map's gonna be changed to reflect things that we've been doing for a year, but have not been shown on the map, just to update the map. And then there's a second set of map changes, which actually is changing the methodology slightly. It gets very wonky against state law, doesn't give you a lot of detail. It just says intersection of 2 stops with 15-minute headways, great. But when you try to actually get into the weeds and figure that out, we've always wanted to be lockstep with SCAG. SCAG and the MPOs are the bodies charged by state law of mapping major transit stops for the region. So they do it for their RTP. So we did that initially. We met them, did their methodology, just updated the transit. That's what our initial map was based on, was SCAG's methodology at the time. Now that they're doing their new 2020 RTP, they're having a look at the methodology again. They went and surveyed all the other MPOs in the state. They talked to the HCD, OPR, got some feedback, making some minor adjustments, which they've sort of adopted earlier, just a month or two ago. And so now we're wanting to be lockstep. We don't want there to be any discrepancy. SCAG mapped that way. In fact, SCAG just released their map. It sort of freaked me out. So we're going to be looking at making sure that the map results are actually the same. Our methodology is the same, but did it come up with the same things we want to be able to explain or reconcile? So that's part of the delay right now. But the big picture is we want to be lockstep with SCAG. So a project comes in and somebody challenges it and say, SCAG says this and you say that. We think it's good for everybody to not freelance here at the City of LA and to go off somebody else's. So that's what you're going to see. A lot of that actually bumps things up, but some things bump down. But so you'll see mixed bag, but certainly that's going to be something people are going to be aware of. We're going to roll it out probably in the next week or two with a cover letter that's going to explain how you vest. We're probably going to give people time till June, 30 days to come in and respond to the changes before those changes actually take effect. So come in, tell your clients if you have any questions, get it verified. Once you're verified, you're locked in. So we're trying to thread the needle there of making a change, but not just ripping the rug out from everyone. Yeah.
I guess this is more of a specific question, but we've been working on a project where they were in I believe a TOC, tier 2 or 3, when they initially started their due diligence, and then when the project, it was time to move forward, and they went and submitted for the review by the housing department, the updated bus routes had removed it completely from a TOC tier. So is there kind of coordination going on to make sure that, if you've been in a tier at one point, unless maybe tier 1, you're not going to fall out of that TOC tier completely? Because it seems kind of problematic policy that 6 months out of the year, maybe TOC tier, and the other 6 months during the winter reduced bus route schedule, you're not in a TOC tier at all, and the kind of leapfrogging development that
Yeah.
can go on.
Yeah, it's sort of the nature of the beast. I mean, when you base your planning incentives on transit service, which changes, you're going to have these issues. I mean, certainly Metro is well aware, and we've met with them many times, and they like the program, and I think it's part of their overall strategic thinking. They're aware, but are they going to make decisions based on TOC being in or out? No. So, I mean, I think your point is well taken. It may not meet the 15 minutes anymore, but it probably still has bus service. Maybe it's 16, 17 minutes, 30 seconds. So I mean, it's not, it's not like it just is now a desert with no transit. But that in that case, you're still able to move the project forward, right? You're just.
No, we're not in any TOC tier any longer.
But you had a verification.
No, we were after they started their due diligence, and once they got this information, they decided time to file, and then by the time they filed,
Too late.
it's now no longer.
Okay, always do your tier verification as soon as possible.
Well,
That's why they brought us.
and now they're redoing the, Metro's redoing their bus schedule, so it's possible in June we'll be back in.
Yeah,
We'll spring it around.
that's right.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Matthew Gillespie and the more brilliant minds in the city. This has been amazingly informative, and I think everybody here could agree that that we can come out of this meeting knowing a little more, and it's amazing how many of these state bills, assembly bills are coming through that impact what we do here locally, and all the regulations and all these considerations. So I think this is an exciting year this year, as we're already off, as you mentioned, to a good start with new bills, and I think it'll be equally exciting to do this again next year, to see what new bills have come through that might impact it. So.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate being here. It's great to talk to housing planning nerds like myself and who sort of get in the weeds and don't mind it. So anytime. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
Excellent. Thank you.